got up there, he stayed about maybe 15 yards away from us. His mom went over to see him first, then his little brother went over, and then he finally motioned for me to come over. And I'm hugging him, and he said, "Dad, I got this. I can do this." That was when I knew he was going to end up doing great things.
A Gold Star father recalls the son he lost. The boy, he says, was born to be a soldier. He looks back on his son Tim's formative time in the Cadet Corps of Virginia Tech, then Tim's first deployment to Iraq. Hello, welcome to the Mighty Pen Podcast. I'm David L. Robbins, your host and founder of the Mighty Pen Project, a free writing program for veterans and their families, in partnership with the Virginia War Memorial Foundation here in Richmond, Virginia. John Price served in the late 60s as an MP at West Point Academy. He learned to love and honor military service. John gave his firstborn son to the Army and to the War on Terror. In this, the first of a two-part series, John shares with us the emotions from pride to nearly unspeakable grief at being the parent of Lieutenant Tim Price. Let's listen to Tim's first tour, read by Dean Knight. Afterward, John and I will talk about his son.
My older son, Tim, was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the U.S. Army Reserves May 10, 2002 at Virginia Tech, where he'd been a member of the Corps of Cadets for 4 years. He graduated in the top 10% of his class and was awarded the Commandant's Cup for Excellence. As a former enlisted military police MP, I was the first to salute the newly minted butter bar, and as we shook hands, he palmed me a silver dollar coin engraved with his name, rank, and date of commissioning. I cannot describe the intense feelings of love and pride I felt at that ceremony, realizing my son would soon be leading a platoon of MPs. Tim's commissioning took place 2 weeks after the start of Military Police Officers Basic at Fort Leonard Wood, so he had to wait until the next class began to start his training. He spent the next 2 months working as a gold bar recruiter, trying to convince potential cadets to enter the Army ROTC program at Tech. He always did his best at any task he was assigned, and was awarded an engraved plaque in recognition of his recruiting efforts before leaving for Missouri for OBC. We stayed in touch with him by email during his training, but the days were long and grueling, so we never heard as much from him as we hoped. He told us that the OBC graduation ceremony was no big deal and not to worry about taking time off work to attend. I felt guilty not being there, but rationalized that I had a lot going on at work and there would always be other opportunities. Tim had his car packed before graduation and began the trip from Rolla, Missouri to Richmond, Virginia, the afternoon of the ceremony. He called and said he'd get a room on the road and be home sometime the next day. I was surprised when I heard the door opening at 4:30 a.m. He had driven the 925 miles straight through in 13.5 hours. After a bear hug and a handshake, I made a pot of coffee, and we spent the next 3 hours going over his training. He sketched out some of the practical exercises on a pad at the kitchen table, and I was impressed with his tactical ability. He finally ran out of gas and slept for most of the day. When he got up, he was off to catch up with his friends. We didn't see much of each other the next few days. He had orders to report to his first duty station at Gießen, Germany, and we drove to Portsmouth in separate vehicles to drop off his car for shipment to Germany. This is one of the perks of being an officer. A week later, I took him to the Richmond airport, and his mother, younger brother Tommy, and I watched his plane depart, not knowing when we would next see him. We felt the mixed emotions of seeing a loved one off to do his duty, the pride of being part of his life, knowing we would miss him, and worry about the danger he might face if we went to war. I was unsettled and apprehensive as I drove home, already missing my son. When Tim arrived in Germany, he found out his unit, the 527th MP Company, was already in Kuwait, part of the troop buildup there. He was eager to join them, but spent weeks doing all the things the Army requires, including paperwork, immunizations, and qualification with the M4 and M9 weapons he would carry. His car arrived before he shipped out, and he explored the German countryside during his off-duty hours. As the rhetoric heated up, and George W. Bush delivered an ultimatum to Saddam Hussein, Tim was still stranded in Germany. His emails told me how frustrated he was at not having been shipped to Kuwait. His nightmare was that the conflict would begin before he assumed command of his platoon, and that was exactly what happened as ground operations began on March 20th, 2003. Tim could only watch the largest attack by coalition forces since the Korean War. He wanted to be part of the invasion, but it started without him. He finally caught a ride into Iraq on a huge C-17 transport, but they couldn't land at Baghdad International Airport because it was still under mortar attack. He spent the night in an aircraft hangar at Basra and flew out the following morning on a smaller, nimbler C-130. Tim finally joined his unit and met with his company commander and the other officers. The company commander told him he'd be taking over 1st Platoon, but hadn't mentioned to the female platoon leader currently in charge of the 1st that she was moving into a staff position. When she asked Tim what he was going to be doing, he said he was the 1st platoon leader, and she went off on him, saying that was her platoon and there must be some mistake. Things were finally ironed out, but it was a rough way to be integrated into a combat unit in Baghdad. It took a couple weeks, but Tim and the female lieutenant patched things up. I'd warned Tim to be deferential to his platoon sergeant. They were functioning just fine before Tim got there, and he would have to prove he'd be an asset, not a liability, before any of his troops would follow him. After about a week, the platoon sergeant assembled the soldiers of the 1st and told them the new lieutenant was a keeper, and they were to protect him until he got the lay of the land. Baghdad was referred to as the Wild West at that time, lawless since the Iraqi military and police force had been disbanded. American commanders took a hands-off posture while there was looting and dozens of revenge killings every night as previously oppressed Shiites settled scores with their Sunni oppressors. Packs of starving feral dogs roamed the streets and began eating the bodies of murdered Iraqis. Tim's first day on patrol was spent cleaning up partially eaten human remains that had baked in the sun for a day or two. None of his training had prepared him for the grim reality of working in a country sliding into civil war. Each platoon leader was assigned a sector of Baghdad and was told to find a suitable building to use as headquarters for new Iraqi police stations. Once the building had been selected, squatters had to be moved out. Efforts were made to peacefully relocate squatters, usually including giving them a small amount of money to find new housing. Tim hired police trainees, but many were illiterate and casual about showing up for work. Other American officers became frustrated with the unreliability and ignorance of their Iraqi policemen and treated them badly. Tim took a different approach and realized he could not compare the Iraqis to his well-trained volunteer force of American MPs. He accepted them for what they were and redoubled training efforts. His approach proved more effective than that of other officers. The honeymoon after initial combat operations were over proved brief and embittered. Unemployed members of Saddam's army and police forces quickly coalesced into an opposition force. Weapons were readily available in Baghdad as coalition forces, in their race to Baghdad, had bypassed huge caches of small arms, ammunition, artillery rounds, hand grenades, mortars, and RPGs. In early attacks on IP stations, insurgents overran some stations, killing the Iraqi policemen who did not flee. One of Tim's stations was attacked while some of his MPs were there in training roles. His MPs, leading the defense of the station with IP support, repulsed the attack, killing 15 insurgents in the process. This was a huge morale booster for the IPs, and the insurgents learned a costly lesson. Weeks later, Tim and all the MP officers in Baghdad were at a meeting when a huge explosion rocked their building. They raced to the windows to see where the explosion had occurred. It was the IP station under the control of a platoon leader Tim had graduated from Tech with. There was a plume of smoke curling hundreds of feet upward into the superheated air above the shattered building. This was the largest truck bomb detonated to date in Baghdad, and scores of IPs and residents had been killed or maimed. High-ranking officers rushed to the scene to take control of the situation, ignoring the lieutenant nominally in charge of the facility. The force of the explosion ripped off the entire front of the police station. Broken glass had shredded those in offices towards the front of the building. The blast had dismembered many of the corpses, and random body parts protruded from piles of rubble. Tim approached his classmate, the lieutenant responsible for the facility, and calmly asked, "What can I do to help?" His fellow Corps grad was gratified to hear those words of support, and the two young officers waded into the carnage side by side, looking for survivors. Operation Iraqi Freedom 1 was a learning exercise for coalition forces, and soon deteriorated into an occupation of a country with no internal leadership. Saddam was in hiding, his two brutal sons had been killed, members of the Ba'ath Party were banned from holding positions of responsibility, and the insurgency gathered momentum. 2 weeks after the truck bomb explosion, one of Tim's IPs, Ali, was nearly killed in a drive-by shooting in front of his police station. He had an AK-47 round lodged deep in his body, with the tip of the bullet touching his spinal cord. At that time, the U.S. military did not provide any medical services for IPs, and the man was taken to an Iraqi hospital. Tim visited Ali frequently and saw his health decline during the first week. The Iraqi doctors had neither the expertise nor equipment to remove the bullet without killing the man. The prognosis was that he would die within the next week. Tim was determined that Ali would get the same treatment any of his MPs would have, had they been wounded. He worked his way up his chain of command, requesting that his Iraqi policemen be admitted to an Army hospital for surgery. This was against Army policy, and Tim put his career on the line each time he made the request. With a careful mixture of tact and perseverance, he finally prevailed. One high-ranking officer was heard to say, "Get this fucking bulldog of a lieutenant off my ass." Rather than censuring him, the top brass finally acceded to his request, and the IP was taken to the Army facility and operated on. The attending surgeon told Tim that Ali would have been dead within a couple of days without the surgery. He would survive, but would likely be paralyzed from the waist down. 10 weeks later, Ali limped into the police station on crutches to thank Tim for saving his life. He gave Tim an ornate brass Koran holder as a gift and embraced him. The lesson was not lost on the rest of Tim's IPs. Tim's platoon quickly became the go-to unit for high-profile assignments, serving as personal security detail for many VIPs, including the commander-in-chief when he visited the troops for Thanksgiving dinner in 2003. Tim split his platoon, remaining with 2 squads guarding Air Force One, while his other 2 squads accompanied the president to the Bob Hope dining facility for dinner and his address to the troops. Security was tight, and the usually unflappable presidential Secret Service detail was nervous with POTUS in a war zone. Tim's easy humor and expertise in Baghdad had a calming effect. Everyone was relieved when Air Force One took off from Baghdad International that evening. The 2 squads guarding the president's plane had missed out on the traditional turkey dinner and drove to the dining facility in search of leftovers. Once his troops were fed, Tim found his way into the executive dining room and discovered platters of leftover lobster tails and filet mignon. He ate 6 lobster tails and headed back to the company area after a long day. His best buddy, Mike Hong, another platoon leader from the 527th, woke up when Tim came in. Tim was so excited about the day and the lobster tails, he told Mike the whole story. When Mike asked, "Did you bring me one?" Tim was embarrassed that he hadn't thought about it. Mike grunted in disappointment and went back to sleep. Tim also handled VIP security details for the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of the Army, and comedian Robin Williams, who flew in for a USO show. There was a plan to capture or kill Muqtada al-Sadr, leader of a major Shiite militia, and Tim's platoon was to be responsible for getting the special ops team in and out of Sadr City alive. The plan sounded like a suicide mission, and he was glad to hear it had been aborted. The day he was eligible for promotion to first lieutenant, Tim replaced his butter bars with shiny new silver ones. He was also awarded a Bronze Star for his efforts. Before he could leave Gießen, he had to confirm that none of his soldiers was suffering from PTSD, and as the platoon leader, he was last to depart on leave. I got an email telling me he'd be delayed for a week because he'd been selected to mentor another MP unit that was shipping out for Baghdad. I was disappointed, but recognized how much good he could do passing on what he had learned during his combat tour. One night in mid-March, as I headed upstairs to bed, the doorbell rang. I couldn't imagine who would ring my doorbell at 11 p.m. When I flipped on the porch light and saw a soldier in BDUs standing there, I wondered what was going on. It took a few seconds for me to realize it was my son. I tore open the door and gave him a bear hug. We both smiled at each other until it hurt. He came into the house and I cracked open a couple of beers. It took a few minutes for me to ask, "How did you get here?" Amber gave me a ride. "Well, where is she?" "Sitting in her car outside." "Well, for God's sake, ask her to come in." I gave another big hug to Tim's school friend who had picked him up at the airport. "Did I surprise you?" "You sure as hell did. I didn't even recognize you standing on the porch." Tim was a notorious practical joker and had planned and executed this surprise visit perfectly. I was overwhelmed with relief to see him and to find he would be home for 4 weeks. He had been on planes the entire day, having stopped in Philly for a few hours to see his mother. Tim, Amber, and I had a beer together, and when Amber left, we called it a night. He slept on the floor in front of the TV that night, and every night he was at home on leave. Tim was dealing with the horrors of that first tour in his own way, and I didn't ask any questions. Some days he never left the house. As he slowly decompressed, I told him there was no pressure, but when he was ready to talk, I would listen. Colonel Rozak, the alumni director for the Corps of Cadets at Virginia Tech, called and asked Tim if he would participate in a new program called the Gunfighter Panel. Combat veterans from the Corps were invited back to address undergraduate cadets on ways they could better prepare themselves for leading a platoon after graduation and commissioning. Tim accepted, and I met him at Tech 2 days before his 25th birthday to videotape the program. It was a great program. We were invited to a reception afterwards. Cadets attending the reception peppered Tim and the other speakers with questions. I thanked Colonel Rozak for the invitation and drove home. Tim stayed another day and then came home to get ready to fly back to Germany. He was relaxed his final night at home. I asked, "What one accomplishment from your first tour are you most proud of?" I got immediate answer. "Dad, that is way too easy. I am proud to say that I brought all my soldiers home alive and well." I could feel the tears welling up as I hugged him and said, "I knew that's what you'd say." My son had matured into a hell of a good officer. I was damn proud to be his father. The next morning, his mother, younger brother Tommy, his uncle Dan, and 3 cousins from Philly all met at Richmond International Airport for a goodbye breakfast. We put Tim on the plane to Frankfurt at 9:30 that morning. As he walked toward his gate in his BDUs, carrying his rucksack, he turned and raised a hand. I saluted him and watched him smile in return. It was the last time I saw my son.
That was Tim's first tour, read by Dean Knight. I'm joined in the studio by the author of Tim's first tour, Tim's father, John Price. John is a longtime member of the Mighty Pen Project, a friend of the program, and a friend to me. John is a Gold Star father. Tim lost his life in Iraq in September of 2004. Today's story is the first of 2 that we'll do in sequence. Tim's first tour featured today, and next week we will do the conclusion of the story, Tim's second tour, and then we'll do also an interview with John Price. But for now, John, let's talk about Tim's first tour. Thank you for joining me, brother. There's some words that seem to describe your son. Easy humor, a knowledge of Iraq, Bronze Star, practical jokes, determination, a different approach from the other officers, and 6 lobster tails. What did I leave out?
I think you covered all the bases, David.
Let's start with the 6 lobster tails, because Tim, as a practical joker and somebody who led men with a different approach from the others, he understood the difference between an Iraqi recruit and an American recruit. Now, this is essentially a boy in his early 20s. It seems, and everything you've ever told us about Tim, is that he was exceptionally mature and at the same time still very much a boy. I want you to hear this line. You said my son had matured into a damn fine officer. Let's start with you. Then we'll go back to Tim. As a father, what could it mean to be able to say that about your son?
Well, as I've said, there was a tremendous amount of pride on my part watching him work his way through Corps Cadets at Virginia Tech. He spent the summer before going up there. I warned him every day it was going to be like basic training. He needed to lay off the cigarettes, lay off the beer, get up in the morning before it got too hot and run a little bit. I finally gave up about a month into the summer, and I said, okay, you're going to have physical problems up there that are going to lay on top of the mental problems. So when the parents were allowed to come up for the first time to visit, he wanted out.
Yeah.
He said, "This is a huge mistake. I don't want any part of this. People are yelling at me all day." And I said, "You can't now. You have to wait till decision week, which is 8 weeks into the semester." Well, we didn't know when we went up that weekend whether or not he was going to opt out of the Corps, which he could have at that point, or whether he was going to stay on. So everybody was kind of holding their breath. Well, when we got up there, he stayed about maybe 15 yards away from us. His mom went over to see him first, then his little brother went over, and then he finally motioned for me to come over. And I'm hugging him, and he said, "Dad, I got this. I can do this." That was when I knew he was going to end up doing great things, and there was a lot of pride from that point on.
What did the transformation look like? Okay. I mean, that's 8 weeks later from Dad, I want out, to Dad, I got this. You're the father. You know him better than any human being ever could or would. And you're looking at him. What did it look like from a father's standpoint?
Tim was a fast read on people, and it did not take him long to realize exactly what the cadre were attempting to accomplish, and that was to dehumanize him. The first thing that is going to happen to you in any military training program is that they're going to beat the ego out of you. And, you can fight that and you're going to lose, or you can accept that fact and just roll on with the program. And Tim was not one to continue to bang his head against the wall. He realized what they were doing, why they were doing it. Nobody hated him. This was the same kind of hazing that everybody that had been in the program had been through, and he rolled with it. He had his little tricks to kind of get back at them. One of the things that he did in formation a couple of mornings was
This is the
the
Chewy,
Chewbacca.
the Chewy story. I love this.
Yeah. All the new cadets felt really put upon. I mean, and they were. They were being mistreated by the upperclassmen. So they're in formation one morning. The entire Corps is on the upper quad. They're raising the colors for the day, turning in their morning report as far as who's present and that stuff that they did on a routine basis. And out of nowhere, Tim does this Chewbacca sound, and the upper quad is old brick buildings. It echoed all the way off of every brick building up there. It was basically a sticking his middle finger in the air to the leadership. All the first year cadets just went bananas, and they never did find out who it was until weeks later. And by then, he was a legend. So, you know, he rolled with it, but he let them know they weren't totally in charge
Right.
too. And, that was the kind of guy that he was. Talk about his maturity. Going back to about ninth or 10th grade, his nickname was the man-child. He was very mature physically early and managed during his time at the Corps of Cadets to match that physical maturity with a level of mental maturity that I don't think a lot of people were able to achieve.
Now let's leap forward from that undeniably charming story to his first days in Iraq. He finally gets there, stages out of Kuwait, and the first thing he's told is be deferential to your platoon sergeants. And he was mature enough to know to do that. Enough so that when they called him a keeper in the end.
One of the things that I learned during my time in the military as an enlisted man was
Also an MP.
yeah, as an MP, and I think Tim ended up in the MPs because of going through an old box of memorabilia that he and I went through. When you come into a platoon that is already functioning well, you are not necessarily bringing anything of value to that platoon. You may end up being a liability. And the only way that you will convince people to follow you into a situation where they might lose their life if you make a bad decision is to convince them that you're a good, solid leader. And when he got to Iraq, he went to Louis Martinez, his platoon sergeant, and said, "Look, I'm the new guy here. You don't know anything about me. What can I do to help?" And that went a long way with Louis. And he also treated his squad leaders with respect. It took a little while for him to convince them that he was going to be an asset, but he did. They were working in 110-degree heat, filling sandbags to put around a machine gun position on the roof of the MP station that he was working at. And he was shoveling sand. And a couple of his enlisted guys said, "Sir, you don't need to be doing this." And he said, "Yeah, you're doing it. I'm doing it."
The story of Ali, the Iraqi policeman who had been shot in the attack on his station, and the determination that Tim showed. And in your story, you said that every time he pushed it, he put his own career on the line. Where did he learn that character, John? Was he born with that? Did he pick that up from you? Did you teach him that? Were you surprised to see his son that much of a mensch?
I don't want to take a lot of credit for it. I would say that that was Tim's personality, and I think the Corps emphasized that when he was there, that if something was worth doing, it was worth doing right. And once he'd made up his mind, he was as determined as anybody that I've ever met that he would accomplish what he set out to do if he thought it was a worthy goal.
This, of course, makes me think of the 6 lobster tails. Once you
Yes.
decide,
Well, anytime we went on vacation down to the Outer Banks or somewhere like that, and I'd say, "Where do you guys want to go for dinner tonight?" It was always take us to a seafood
yeah,
buffet.
but John, most of us who get to 2 or 3 lobster tails, we tap out. But you're describing a young man that went for 6.
Well, he may have looked at that as a challenge
Yeah.
and an opportunity.
We'll be continuing Tim's story next week. We'll talk about you as a Gold Star father, Tim as a name that goes up on the wall of honor here at the Virginia War Memorial. John, last question for you. I remember when you came to the Mighty Pen Project, first time, maybe 7, 8 years ago, and your first several stories were not about Tim. And if you recall, maybe after a year of classes, I asked you to come out in the hall with me. And I said, "John, I'm never going to ask you to write about your son, but I think writing about him and talking about him is why you came here." And I recall very clearly saying to you, John, that when you're ready, the men and women in that room and me are ready to receive those stories from you. And from that point on, you really embraced the courage, the emotional courage of writing about Tim. And these 2 stories have been, in particular, very moving about the young man that you brought into the world, the young man that we all lost. I find your story as the parent as brave and as compelling as his courage in uniform. And everybody that knows you thinks that. And that is because, John, you had the emotional courage to step up and address it.
I don't think of myself as being as much of a man as my son grew into. That may be a little humbling as far as being a father, but it's also a source of great pride. When I found out about this class, I was very interested in it because I had some limited writing ability, but I did not have the skill set that I would be able to put the story of my son in print at a level that I felt he had earned. And I wasn't going to do a half-assed job of it. And thankfully, working with you for a couple of years upped my game to a point to where I felt competent enough as a short story writer to be able to share experiences with my son and how I felt about him. The whole Mighty Pen group, the premise of working with veterans, you're in a non-judgmental environment. You're dealing with people that served. You're dealing with people that lost friends. So, the idea of loss is ingrained in those that served in combat zones. So it was a proper environment, and with your help and a gentle nudge, I got to a point to where I felt I was capable of giving Tim what he had earned and sharing it with other people.
I speak for a lot of people, and I thank you for that, John. We'll continue this.
Thank you, David.
The Mighty Pen Project is a free writing program for military veterans and their families, offered by the Virginia War Memorial Foundation, a 501c3 nonprofit. If you'd like to learn more about the Mighty Pen or just send us your thoughts, email us at mppodcast@vawarmemorial.org or use the link in the podcast description. If you're a veteran or a family member of a serviceman or woman listening to this podcast anywhere in America, and you want to learn how to best write and tell your own powerful stories, you can sign up for one of our Mighty Pen writing workshops on Zoom. If you want to read today's piece and many more, use the link to go to the Mighty Pen archive. If you enjoy this podcast, please share it. Music for this episode was provided by Jackson Albrecht. Lastly, if you'd like to support the Mighty Pen's efforts to record and preserve these stories of service, adventure, and sacrifice, follow the charitable donation link in the podcast description. I'm David L. Robbins, and I want to thank you for listening to the Mighty Pen Podcast. It's an honor. Perfect.